At the end of the 1950s, as mass media was expanding and a rising number of households were getting televisions, the Vatican also had to join in the fun. In 1959, Pope John XXIII instituted the Vatican's Film Library.
Tutto il materiale viene dalle donazioni.
All material is donated, so there was no systematic collection. Rather, at different times, material was given to the Holy Father, and he rightly put it in the archive, because it was impossible to keep it all in the pontifical apartment. The institution of the Film Library coincided with the Second Vatican Council, also called for by John XXIII. As media was expanding and the global church was more readily available, Italian media was able to film much of the council.
Il Concilio Vaticano II è stato un
The
evento.
Second Vatican Council was an immediate event because it was being filmed. The people were expectantly waiting. They wanted to see what happened, what the council did. The church was transforming. It was becoming closer to how it is now in modern times. John XXIII felt the need to bring the church closer than it was. Yet the archives maintained inside today's film library date back much further than the late 1950s. The first movie on hand is from 1896, when Pope Leo XIII was recorded walking around the Vatican gardens to prove he was in good health. From there, media expanded, and it became somewhat normal to video record the Pope. One pontiff in particular took to the screen.
Siamo nel 42, un'epoca.
We're in 1942, an age in which people can't come to Rome to see the Pope. So, as film circulated during the war, this is a gift Pope Pius XII gives the world. It was for the faithful to be able to see the Pope, to see how he spent his day. For 8 months, the cameras were inside the Vatican. They followed the Holy Father, recording the audiences, his free time, and everything in between. It was to give him a more human image, bringing the faithful closer to the pontificate. Some of these papal images contributed to the around 8,000 titles and films held by the Vatican. Many others were donations. Each film is in various formats, including magnetic and digital. Beyond Catholic films and documentaries, there are a plethora of movies unrelated to the Church.
Noi abbiamo delle immagini sui bombardamenti.
We have images of the bombings in Japan during the war. There's an image by missionary fathers of the 50s of the population they've joined. Nothing had ever been filmed by anyone, so they're anthropologically very important images. The archive also contains high-class cinematography. We have one of Ben-Hur's originals. We have the trilogy of The Lord of the Rings. So there are all those films that have a spiritual role to transcend humanity. These ancient reels and many more are preserved in an air-conditioned room between 57.2 and 64.4 degrees Fahrenheit, with 33% humidity. For some of the older films, there's also a machine that cleans the reels and preserves their elasticity with a special liquid, making sure they can be shown again at any time. Many of the original old projectors remain, even if they are not used as often with the continued digitalization of film. The restructuring of the building to conserve each of the film reels was in the late 80s, early 90s. Meanwhile, the movie theater was remodeled in 2005. There are 54 new cushioned chairs, replacing the previous wooden ones, and new speakers lining the walls to create more of a theater atmosphere. Currently, there's a steady flow of people who both show movies or documentaries and those who attend. Viewers are often made up by members of the Vatican Curia, the diplomatic corps, students, or even the Pope himself.
Giovanni Paolo II, che era un appassionato di
John Paul II was passionate about cinema, so despite his many commitments, he was able to dedicate small amounts of time to film. Now, it's a little complicated. I'm not saying the Pope's workload has increased, but it grants less and less space for the Pope to stop 2 or 3 hours, which can be a lot. Yet documentaries and films are continuously shown in this unique Vatican theater, which also produces works themselves. They're currently working on a special documentary for their 60th anniversary since the opening of the Film Library. They hope to show it also in this room. Maybe the showing will coincide with a surprise visit by a man in white who lives in the building just next door, Pope Francis. While most know about the Vatican museums, very few know another museum lies within the Vatican walls, that of Vatican Radio, dating back to 1929. It was built by Guglielmo Marconi for Pius XI as a way to get the Pope's voice out to the world. Still today, the historical evidence of the early beginnings remain intact, cared for by Vatican Radio staff like Giorgio Patacini. Giorgio Patacini explained many of the objects, like the microphone Pope Pius XI used to make his very first radio transmission. This is just one object among many found within this small museum.
Here we find some Vatican radio transmitters by Marconi on my left and telephones to my right. For Marconi particularly, it was important because it worked throughout the World War II period and also served to send messages to search for people.
These searchers were through a program that helped find people who had been lost during the war. Vatican Radio would then say if someone was a prisoner in India or in the United States. They were possible since the radio was and still is independent. So while other stations around the world were silenced during the Cold War or World War II, the Vatican's voice continued. When the Holy See's radio first began, it was transmitted in English, Spanish, Italian, and French. Marconi worked mainly in Italian and English, conducting experiments and growing the radio capabilities within the Vatican. One example was his attempt to see how a telegraphic signal could be transmitted.
His main idea was to equip this machine with an antenna in order to remove this physical connection. He did in 1895. The first experiment was completed by ringing one of two bells 2.5 miles apart. Then his brother at the other bell fired the historical rifle shot. So he understood the bell had rung and the experiment worked. From this date on, radio broadcasting and radio telegraphy began.
Marconi had created the first commercial wireless telegraphy system of radio transmission, done through hertz and waves. However, after World War I, a change occurred.
After the First World War, experiments were carried out to transmit voice. At that point, instead of being more bidirectional between a receiver and a transmitter, it became unidirectional, so the signal could be launched in either, depending on certain directions and forms. Whoever had a machine could hear it, so it no longer had to be two-way.
This was also done with huge antennae, sized according to the range of frequencies the radio station was using. The International Telecommunication Union in Geneva then coordinated all of them, so each station had optimal frequency. The Holy See was part of that group. Over the years, the Vatican's antenna has changed to adapt and include different countries and longer frequencies.
Obviously, the era began with shortwave. Then transmission changed with new technology. We went ahead with frequency modulation, with satellites, and with the internet, of course, where we now do the most.
Patacini says this museum serves to help remember how far radio has come. From the early days with large equipment and buttons to radios and phonographs. It's a way to thank the person who started it all and keep his legacy alive for future generations. It's no secret the Catholic Church is a leader in many aspects, such as healthcare, education, and also communication. Nearly 90 years ago, the very first international broadcasting outlet in the world began, and it was also started by the Catholic Church, Vatican Radio. Andrea Tornielli is the editorial director of the Vatican's Dicastery of Communication, of which the radio is a part.
Vatican Radio is almost 90 years old. It was founded at the request of Pius XI to show that the Holy See has always paid attention to means of communication. He immediately understood that the radio would be a powerful means of communication for the future and to include many people in the Catholic world.
Yet while the radio began with 4 languages, it grew. Now countries such as Slovakia, Hungary, and Poland are represented as one of the 35 languages with their own radio program, transmitting the Pope's words and messages to the world. While the largest language in the world, Chinese, with 1.2 billion native speakers, receives news about the Pope, also the second largest, Spanish. Spanish-speaking people are not only found in Latin America, the United States, or in Europe. There's also a community of Latin Americans in New Zealand. No matter where they are, they can connect with our website and listen to the voice of the Pope and what the Pope's doing at certain times, like at Easter or Christmas. Most of the journalists who work at the radio have worked there for an average of 20 years. They've seen different popes come and go and learned each one's preferred mode of communication. One of the longest-standing journalists is Sean Patrick Lovett. He's been at the Vatican Radio for 45 years. He's the director of English programming and has seen 5 popes.
Paul VI, John Paul I, John Paul II, Benedict XVI, and now Francis, has brought and brings his own particular style. But if I have to think of a turning point, it would be at 17 minutes past 5 on May the 13th, 1981. The 4 shots that shook the world when Pope St. John Paul II was shot in St. Peter's Square just down the road. That was probably one of the great moments in my radio career, I think.
The particular aspect about Vatican Radio is that each career and program inside it is different. For example, the only channel in the entire radio that transmits live is Italian. It's a local radio wave show that airs from 7:30 a.m. to 8 p.m. They have a talk show, various guests, news on Pope Francis, and also music.
We really like that this studio here behind me is a meeting place, hosting not only Catholics, not just Christians, but expanding to the secular world and to people from other religious denominations. In short, it's a radio that can be a place of encounter. It's a radio going out to the peripheries, as like Pope Francis asks.
From the very beginning until now, in the middle of their reform process, the radio has continued. Its 90th birthday will be celebrated on February 12, 2021, in just 2 years.
Vatican and World News.